The sudden death of the top authority in the Sunni Muslim world raises questions about Al-Azhar's future, its role and whether it has been hijacked by the state. Has the diminishing role of Al-Azhar in the Muslim world given a chance for alternative Islamic movements to maybe fill a vacuum? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Imran Garda. Sheikh Mohammed Sayed Tantawi, Sunni Islam's most senior cleric, died last week of a heart attack. The 82-year-old Egyptian headed the Al-Azhar mosque and university, a crucial institution for Sunni Muslims. Well, this made him one of the most influential and controversial religious figures in the Islamic world. Rawya Rageh in Cairo has more on Tantawi the man.
For 14 years, Sheikh Mohammed Sayed Tantawi ran Sunni Islam's highest seat of learning. And if there was anything that marked his tenure, it was controversy. Sheikh Tantawi straddled a fine line. He championed a moderate Islam and denounced extremism. But the Grand Cleric, whose position is handpicked directly by the president, was too liberal for some. In fact, opponents viewed him as the theological functionary through which the state marketed not only its brand of Islam, but also other policies.
All the leaders of Al-Azhar, Sheikh Al-Azhars, are appointed by the government. This is since 1961.
Like him or not, Sheikh Tantawi's word carried heavy weight among Egyptians and the world's more than 1 billion Muslims. For years, he sponsored interfaith and cultural dialogue. But he drew criticism from nationalists for branding suicide bombers as extremists and for backing the state's tight border policies towards the besieged Gaza Strip. He was also a supporter of the Palestinian cause and had recently accepted an invitation to visit the Al-Aqsa Mosque as a sign of solidarity against Israel's practices in occupied Arab East Jerusalem. That just 2 years after critics blasted him for shaking the hand of Israeli President Shimon Peres at an interfaith conference in New York. Many called for his resignation then. But perhaps his biggest supporters were among the reform camp in Egypt. The sheikh backed a controversial organ transplant law, denounced female circumcision, and supported women's right to get an easy divorce.
The independence of Al-Azhar does not mean it should put itself on a collision course with the government, but instead it means maintaining its academic and intellectual independence. It should not get involved in political matters that are supposed to be left for political parties.
And in October, in one of his last controversial moves, Sheikh Tantawi banned the niqab, the full facial veil at Al-Azhar's campuses, saying it has no basis in Islam. Public universities followed suit, prompting hundreds of lawsuits around the country. Sheikh Tantawi simply symbolized the struggle between the government's version of Islam and an increasingly conservative trend within the population, which is likely going to make his replacement a difficult task for the state. Rawya Rageh, Al Jazeera, Cairo.
Well, joining our discussion today are our guests in Doha, el-Karanshawy, founding Dean of the Qatar Faculty of Islamic Studies at Qatar Foundation. In Cambridge, Khalid Haroub, Islamic Affairs Analyst and Lecturer in Modern Middle East Politics at the University of Cambridge. And via broadband from Colorado, we're joined by Genevieve Abdu, Analyst and author of No God But God, Egypt and the Triumph of Islam. Thank you all of you for joining us. Khalid Haroub in Cambridge, if I could start with you, what's Sheikh Tantawi's legacy?
Well, as you said in your report, I think it's a controversial legacy. On the one hand, his very long years on the head of Al-Azhar institution have confirmed the status of this institution as one of the closest to the state. It used to be a legitimizer of the state's policies and actions. He issued so many fatwas basically supporting any official line of the Egyptian government. On the other hand, however, he had so many, I would say, liberal views when it comes to social and religious practices in Islam compared to other conservative views and fatwas. So you have, I think, on the balance, so many controversial legacy, I guess, on his side.
Genevieve Abdu, on the issue of him being liberal, should we be giving credit where credit was due? Because he was a maverick in many ways. He swam against the tide. He outlawed female genital mutilation. He had a very modern, holistic, liberal interpretation of the issue of riba or interest in Islam. With that in mind, was he quite dynamic and liberal for his time?
Well, I think he was dynamic and also provocative, but the question I think that's always been one that's very important to Al-Azhar is, did his views represent what we can determine to be the prevailing opinion of mainstream Muslim societies? And I would say that on that ground, he sort of failed, because even though he did articulate a lot of the views of the state, part of his controversial reign as the Sheikh was that he didn't really represent a lot of the views of Muslims across the broader Islamic world.
Hatim el-Karanshawy, is that a fair point, that he didn't have a very democratic mandate, if you like? His views didn't represent the vast majority of not only Egyptian Muslims, but Muslims in general?
Well, it depends how you define the what's the mechanism to reflect this democracy. Certainly, he had his own views, which, as already said by the two previous commentators, some of his views were very controversial. Certainly, some of his views would go in the mainstream of Muslims. However, some were a bit different. How you classify this? Is it when you say he's a liberal because he differs from the masses? In the same time, he is denounced as not being democratic for not reflecting the masses. I think the word controversial, which seems quite a good word. However, in many of his views, that's not necessarily the highly publicized. The day-to-day affairs and the other concepts in the Muslim world, I think he was to a large extent with the mainstream. Yet, I agree that some of his views were very controversial.
Well, Mr. el-Karanshawy, for example, looking at one specific, he gave religious legal backing for Egypt's barrier to block off those supplies, whether humanitarian goods or rockets from Egypt into the besieged Gaza Strip. That most definitely wasn't a popular view amongst Egyptians, amongst Palestinians, and Muslims all over, right?
Yes, that was one of the things that were not necessarily in the mainstream. I agree with that. Once again, would it be the right thing to be all the way through against the state? I mean, that's the kind of... But I agree. I mean, on that specific incident, yes, the views were not necessarily popular with large number of people in Egypt and maybe outside Egypt as well.
Okay, let's take a broader view now, try and understand Al-Azhar a bit more and its history. Well, given its long and interesting history, for many, Al-Azhar is more than a mosque and center of learning. It was built by Egypt's Fatimid rulers in 972 AD, who were incidentally Shia, not Sunni. But in the 12th century, a Sunni ruler, Salah ad-Din Ayyubi, took over the city and the mosque. Well, it was here that the Egyptians launched a revolt against Napoleon's occupation in the 18th century. After he withdrew, the new monarchs of Egypt tried to limit the power of the mosque. But in 1936, it was guaranteed complete independence. However, that era ended with the Egyptian Revolution of 1952. After that, the then president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, placed the university under the direct control of the government. The president would henceforth select the Grand Imam of the mosque, and all the university scholars became state employees, a trend that's been followed to date. Well, while it is still popular among the masses, it's often described as being used to justify the actions of the government. Let's go back to Khalid Haroub in Cambridge. Is that a fair and accurate claim against Al-Azhar, that in many ways it's a tool and lackey of the state?
Oh yes, I agree on this, especially as you mentioned, since the 1960s onward, we have this great institution been manipulated basically by the successive Egyptian governments. Historically speaking, Al-Azhar or any other similar religious institution in the Muslim world used to have a clear distance from any ruling elite. And by doing so, they would have this overseeing function. They would balance themselves in between the ruling elite and the public. trying to challenge the ruling elite, any regime, any government, if they deviated from what they perceive as the true path of Islam on the one hand, and if they have not done justice to the public. And at the same time, they would even convince the public to take some of the wrongdoings of any ruler and avoid any fitna, civil strife or something. So this kind of equilibrium functioning of the traditional Islamic institution back in the Islamic history has been lost, favoring this new role, new manufactured role of Al-Azhar as a legitimizer of the state, which is a very unfortunate development actually in the recent days.
Janeef Abdu, do you believe it's a legitimizer of the state, that it's just there to maintain this sort of traditional power, nipping any revolutionary calls or even just small calls for change in the bud and maintaining the status quo?
Well, I think that its modern function is a bit more complicated than that, because you do have a sheikh who is a functionary of the state, as we all agree. But I think that you also have other scholars within Al-Azhar that have deviated from both the Grand Sheikh's position and the state's position on several issues. If you look, for example, in the sort of the rank and file of Al-Azhar, you have a lot of scholars who have been part of the Fatwa Committee, who have been part of other institutions, the Research Academy within Al-Azhar, that have taken far more traditional positions on social issues such as female genital mutilation, such as even divorce decrees, women's rights. They've taken far more conservative religious positions. So I think that we have to be careful to distinguish the Grand Sheikh from also the institution itself, which I think has expressed a lot of independence from the state position over the last, say, years that since Gad al-Haq had died and Sheikh Tantawi took over as Grand Sheikh.
Hatem el-Karanshawy, the point Janeef Abdu is making is that Al-Azhar is not a monolith. It has many diverse views. Do you agree that there are many who are different and would distinguish themselves from the Grand Sheikh within Al-Azhar and the many divergent views that there are there?
Yes, indeed. I mean, we have on the wide spectrum of views that in many cases differ from the opinions of the Grand Sheikh. And as I said, some examples have been mentioned, whether these examples are to the right or the left of the Sheikh's opinion, or even sort of on the political issues, or on pure interpretation of some religious questions. Even throughout the days since the 1952 revolution, in many instances the Azhar as an institution admittedly is not that much, but they have taken. Dr. Abdu has just mentioned the Sheikh Gad al-Haq. A number of occasions he had a different status, not in a collusion course, but he has a very clearly distinctive opinion that differs from the mainstream of the government at the time. So yes, I do agree it's not a monolithic institution, and as I said, there are a large number of scholars. It has a very active university, and as said, as in such place, yes, you have different views, different opinions.
You mentioned, sorry to interrupt you, you mentioned that it is a university. It's not just, an Islamic university, not just a university where, say, Sharia is studied. How do you rate it as a university? Because there have been claims in the past few decades that the academic standards have plummeted, really, in Al-Azhar.
If we talk about academic standards, I mean, Al-Azhar is living on the other university, to be more precise, is within a university atmosphere that includes all other Egyptian universities. I mean, we have to admit that generally speaking, the academic standards have been not really in the status that we would like it to be. However, let's not forget that some of the schools in Al-Azhar University have some of the individual scholars, not the whole university, but some of the scholars and some of the schools have achieved quite a very good status in a number of international conferences, published papers, and so on, the ranking method that's used. But definitely it is not the status that we would like it to be, or that it should be, given the number of scholars and the qualifications of some of its staff.
Khalid Horoub, what will it take for Al-Azhar to stop being a theatre of battle, ideological battle between the state and the biggest opposition group in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, before I take this question, Iman, just allow me to quickly to comment about the diversity of Al-Azhar institution and how monolithic or not the institution is. I think, yes, of course, at the end of the day, any collectivity, however small, you wouldn't have it as monolithic as people would think, even in the family. But when we talk about Al-Azhar, we take it as a whole. The whole institution, I think, the orientation of this institution was more or less very close to the functioning of Egyptian government. So when I spoke about how do we situate, say, the Al-Azhar institution, I said, and I am still saying, that it was by and large part of the state orientation and governance. Now back to your point about whether Al-Azhar has been this kind of battlefield between ideological controversies and arguments between the state and the Muslim Brotherhood and others. Yes, and I think in part I think we have some group, a split group somehow. Maybe the expression is not correct, but we have Al-Azhar Scholars Front, which is very close to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And they, all the time, they have been trying to express the other view, if you like, unlike the official line of Al-Azhar. So if Tantawi is saying Al-Azhar or I support this barrier on the Gaza border and Egypt border, then you have the Al-Azhar Front scholars saying something different. So trying to reflect, trying to express what they see as the other, or the more, if you like, Islamic and the closer to the public and sentiment, not only in Egypt but also across the Arab world. They would say we see things differently. And in my view, and briefly, I think Al-Azhar is judged, and Tantawi himself is judged, according to two measures. One is Israel and Palestine, and secondly, the authoritarian nature of the regime in Egypt.
Right.
So these two big major elements, I think, people in the public perception, they use these two measures to judge not only Al-Azhar, but any other, if you like, symbol or any other intellectual or public intellectual platform.
I'm intrigued that you've actually mentioned that he's judged by his views with regards to Israel-Palestine. He was also heavily judged and quite controversially judged with regards to his views over suicide bombings. If you'll allow me, I'll draw your attention to Dr. Tahir Al-Qadri, a highly respected Muslim scholar from Pakistan. He attracted the interests of policymakers and security chiefs by condemning terrorism and suicide bombers. He said, and quote, "They can't claim that their suicide bombings are martyrdom operations and that they become the heroes of the Muslim nation. No, they become heroes of hellfire, and they are leading towards hellfire. There's no place for any martyrdom, and their act is never, ever to be considered jihad." I think I'll bring in Genevieve Abdu here. This rejection of suicide bombing in particular, and in general, a more tame interpretation of jihad and certain aspects of Islam, which Tantawi has done, which this Tahir Al-Qadri, this Sheikh, has done as well. Is this a new trend of ijtihad or interpretation of Islam? What do you make of it? How do you think this new trend is going to be perceived by people?
Well, I don't necessarily think it's a new trend. I mean, this has been an ongoing debate among Islamic scholars for, the last 25,
so are
30 years.
Are they just coming out into the open more often now?
Well, I think that, they're coming out into the open, but also, of course, we can't ignore the political dimension of this. I mean, of course, state appointees, state officials are going to have this view, because that's something that the government needs to advance, both internally and also in its relationship to Western governments. So I think that these views are much more political than they are religious. But I think that also, in respect to the last topic that we were discussing, sort of the role of Al-Azhar, I think that this is very indicative of the kind of great problem that President Mubarak is going to face in appointing the next sheikh, which is that, is this sheikh going to be more of a political figure, or is he going to reflect sort of the religious views of Muslims in Egypt and in the region? And I think that that's going to be the big question, because there's a lot of political liability for President Mubarak, especially now as we get closer to the succession, as to whether this sheikh should represent more the views of societies or the views of the state. And so I think that that's why this appointment is particularly significant now at Egypt's point in history as we get closer to the succession.
Hatem el-Karanshawy, do you think that Hosni Mubarak could provide a masterstroke by appointing somebody that the people love?
Why not? Why not? I mean, so far the names that have been named for the position. Again, it's very difficult to predict, but the three names that were mentioned, I think all of them have quite a good degree of popularity. Again, you cannot say that someone that everyone would think unanimously that he is admired by either the people or all the people or all the governments. There is always a scope for difference, and there's no one that can unify the whole nation. However, I think the name that have been mentioned, all of them has their support between the masses for their views, although people would differ with them sometimes.
Yeah, there's no one that can unify a nation. There's no one really that can unify a billion people. Khalid Haroub, does Sunni Islam and over 1 billion followers actually need a sort of Vatican or a clergy? Do Muslims from Java to, I don't know, Mali to Khartoum to Toronto need an Al-Azhar type of guiding authority to look after them?
No, I don't think so. I mean, one of the greatest maybe aspect of Sunni Islam is exactly this, is the lack of any religious authority that could claim having the ultimate saying on any religious or even non-religious affair. And I think maybe, in my view, maybe this could seem kind of cynical, but I think one of the greatest aspects of Tantawi's legacy is that he really destroyed any perceived aura or symbolism of any religious authority in Sunni Islam by encouraging people over criticizing him because of so many controversial fatwas and positions that he had taken. So I think functioning in that manner and issuing so many fatwas, letting people in the public, journalists, people even in the layman in the street would criticize Tantawi, this means there is no any, if you like, aura or religious authority, sacred one. There is no holiness in this position. And I think we have to thank him for that.
Yeah, that's a creative interpretation of his legacy. Janeeb Abdu, what do you think of that?
Well, I think that that's a very more kind interpretation of his legacy. I think that what we have seen, which is, I think, very positive, is we have seen people challenging such an Islamic scholar, which is a very positive thing as Islam has evolved in modern times and interpreted differently. So I think, though, that in the general point, again, what is a great challenge now for the Egyptian government is how they can appoint someone who has legitimacy, because of course it's not just enough to have legitimacy within the state. He must have legitimacy within the populations. And so as time goes on, and I don't want to draw Iran into this because of course it's a completely different situation, it's a Shiite country, but we are seeing much more the legitimacy of religious leaders challenged by societies. And we are seeing a great divide now between religious societies and state functionaries. Yes. And this is why I think Al-Azhar is at a very important juncture now in its role among Muslims.
An important juncture indeed. Good point there. We have run out of time, so this will be the end of the program. Hatem el-Karanshawy, Khalid Haroub and Janeeb Abdu, thank you very much, all of you, for sharing your thoughts with us here on Inside Story. Thank you, the viewer, for joining us as well. As always, we welcome your comments, your suggestions or your questions. You can email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye-bye.